Madam Chair, Mr. President, members of the expert mechanism, representatives of indigenous peoples, excellencies, distinguished participants. I'm really pleased to open the 18th session of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. We know how crucial these sessions are to advancing the human rights of indigenous peoples by focusing on their specific needs and rights and creating momentum for change. And indeed, over the past few years, there have been important developments which promote respect for the rights of indigenous peoples across the world. For example, Colombia recently formalized indigenous local governments, granting them authority to oversee budgets and administration within their territories. In Finland, recent legal reforms have strengthened indigenous self-identification and institutional autonomy. The Guatemalan government holds monthly meetings with indigenous peoples, leading to several local agreements on territorial claims, among other issues. There's also growing recognition of indigenous approaches and worldviews. In New Zealand, following the Treaty of Waitangi, certain rivers have been granted legal identity. In South Asia, too, some rivers have specific legal recognition. Likewise, certain mountains and land of significance to indigenous peoples in various countries have been endowed with rights of their own. And just 2 weeks ago, in an important advisory opinion on states' obligations to protect and restore ecosystems, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights specifically noted that state actions must respect indigenous knowledge. Despite these advantages, violations against indigenous peoples remain widespread. Around the world, mining and extractive activities, deforestation and large-scale agricultural exploit and destroy lands and territory without the consent of indigenous peoples. And many indigenous peoples still lack formal recognition of land rights, making it harder to defend their territories. Indigenous peoples are also among the most exposed and vulnerable to climate chaos. Droughts, floods, deforestation, and wildfires are destroying the ecosystems that have sustained them for millennia. Across regions, indigenous peoples face pervasive discrimination in accessing justice, health, education, and other services. Indigenous human rights activists, and you know that very well, continue to face threats and reprisals. According to the data gathered by my office, in 2023 and 24, 26% of defenders who were killed were indigenous people, largely in the Americas. And I'm very concerned about the widespread impunity for the killings of courageous activists. I urge states to address this immediately by investigating these crimes and prosecuting those responsible. Distinguished participants, digital technologies, including artificial intelligence, are fundamentally reshaping our societies and are having an impact on the indigenous peoples. On the one hand, AI tools, including speech recognition and translation models, are preserving and reviving indigenous languages. AI can also support indigenous peoples in monitoring environmental changes to help conserve biodiversity. On the other hand, states are using AI-driven surveillance tools to track and harass indigenous peoples, human rights defenders, and we know through information from indigenous communities, including maps and artwork, that this is being used to train AI models without their consent. And indigenous peoples are still largely excluded from key policy decisions on the development of AI. It will be up to all of us to decide how to develop and roll out new technologies to minimize the risks they pose and maximize their potential for good. And if I had one request, it will be so important that within the AI development, that human rights are very central to its development, its use, and the way it's applied. Without human rights guardrails, these rapid developments risk reproducing and entrenching inequalities of our world, including those that are experienced by indigenous peoples. My office is beginning to examine the impact of AI on indigenous peoples, including on the use of indigenous data. And I welcome the study of the expert mechanism that will be presented today, which contains really important recommendations on protecting indigenous peoples' right to data. Specifically, it highlights that AI must respect indigenous data sovereignty as a component of indigenous peoples' self-determination and self-governance. In the face of these tremendous challenges, the road ahead will not be easy. We must unite our efforts so that policies and decisions going forward on climate action, on the development of digital technologies and beyond, reflect the wisdom and experience of indigenous peoples. This is not only essential to respect and fulfill the human rights of indigenous peoples, but there is also growing recognition that the ideas and approaches of indigenous peoples hold important lessons for all of us. For example, traditional indigenous practices, including the communal management of forests and fisheries, can mitigate the impact of climate change. More generally, knowledge of the land and respect for the rights of nature are inherent to cultural practices, religions, and traditional laws of many indigenous peoples. This worldview can inspire new models of engagement with our planet, including constitutional recognition that nature and its defenders have legal standing, that there is stronger protection against environmental harm, and recognition of the crime of ecocide, including under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Indigenous peoples can also make clear contributions to climate justice, particularly on the minerals needed for the transition to renewable energy. My office supported indigenous representatives' engagement with the Secretary General's panel on critical energy transition minerals, which, as you know, was issued last year. It's an important report that recommends that human rights be respected where minerals are mined and along the entire value chain. Distinguished participants, I commend the leadership of the Human Rights Council in ensuring the meaningful participation of indigenous peoples, as the President has mentioned. In September 24, it was really a milestone moment for the United Nations. For the first time, indigenous representatives from the Human Rights Council's 7 indigenous socio-cultural regions addressed a regular session of the Council as direct representatives of their people. And I really hope that other bodies of the United Nations will follow the Council's example. You also mentioned, Mr. President, the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples as a key tool for participation. And thanks to the fund, more than 4,000 representatives of indigenous peoples have expressed their views in international processes. But I also need to urge states to strengthen their support to the fund, which faces a critical shortfall, allowing it to support only about 150 of more than 6,000 applicants every year. So 150 out of 6,500 applicants every year. Before I close, I would also like to express my deep concern, which was mentioned by the President of the Council as well, that indigenous peoples continue to face intimidation and reprisals for engaging with the United Nations. This is unacceptable and it must stop. Speaking up should not have to come at the cost of people's safety. And we know how important international meetings like this are. They are a platform for indigenous peoples to raise their concerns, to share their experience and their knowledge. But they are also a space for the international community to listen to the knowledge of indigenous peoples, to their innovative approaches to some of our world's most urgent challenges. I wish you all a very fruitful session and look forward to the outcomes. Thank you very much.